I was reviewing the latest results from the hospital just to give you an update, and something caught my eye. The targeted monitoring wells that they test all the time, 91% of those test for no TPH-DRO. But the ones they don't test all the time, the non-targeted wells, 70% test positive for TPH-DRO. So that's a pretty big difference. 10% of the ones they test and 70% of the ones they don't test have TPH-DRO. There is still surfactant in the groundwater as of April the 22nd. And we were told way back when that the surfactant was completely biodegradable and would disappear in 30 days. Well, 2 months later, they're still picking it up in excess of 50 parts per million.
You have a theory of why it's showing up in the pumps that are not using? Is that because they don't pump it out?
I've been doing I've taken a lot of time looking at it, and I kind of charted this. The purple circles is where the oil is detected, and if you look at it, there is a slight curve to it.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I had mentioned before is sometimes you go from a whole row of detects to a single detect with nothing in between. So it's kind of hit and miss. The oil doesn't really, you can't follow the flow pattern. Well number 20, monitoring well 20, has just seen its highest TPH-DRO, 7.0. The previous high was 2.0. So we're seeing more oil coming across Brown Street than we had previously. Also monitoring well 17, which is on the other side of the parking lot, on the opposite end of monitoring well 20, also had TPH-DRO. And my theory at the time was that they weren't interested in doing site cleanup, that this was all about cleaning the monitoring wells so that those monitoring wells would give them better results. This shows that that happened. 90% of those wells aren't showing any TPH-DRO. Is that because it's not there anymore? No, because it's in 70% of all the other wells. It's just not coming into the monitoring well because it's being reabsorbed.
Sorry.
Because it's being reabsorbed onto the soils that they clean. You remember what I said, like cleaning out a sponge? That's what's happened. So now that the clean soils are able to reabsorb oil and keep it from getting to their sampling point.
So if we wait another couple of years, we'll probably be back up to where we were before.
Yes. Because keep in mind that with all of the injections and extractions that they did not remove 1 measurable gallon of oil. Nowhere. Not in the pump and treat system, which was running continuously. Not in what they pulled out and tested. There was nothing there that you could even put in a cup and say, here's the oil we got out of the ground. So what was the goal of this? If it wasn't to improve the mass removal of the oil, it was to clean the soils around the wells. But the fact that we had it at monitoring well 17, which is the furthest west on the site, and there's no other monitoring wells after that, is concerning. And that you're not picking it up in the monitoring wells in the parking lot between what they're calling what they call the 4 wells. They're sentinel wells. The sentinel wells set up by the hospital. There's nothing between those sentinel wells and monitoring well 20 and 17. So that you have that area, the square, the rectangle, that no oil is being detected in.
Doesn't mean it's not.
So the concern is that it could be doing that. I wish I had a bigger picture for everyone to see. And what makes that significant is that over here, where all my squiggly lines are at is where the geologist has told us is an underground riverbed or a Palestine flow channel.
So it would make sense, it would be sucked over time.
So that's one of the concerns. I just wanted to point that out. In reviewing it, it popped into my head that, hey, most of the ones that are targeted don't have TPH-DRO, but 70% of the ones that aren't targeted do.
And does that underground bed carry out to the river?
It goes right past the water plant. to
How
the
deep
river.
is it?
The channel?
Yeah.
The aquifer is about, it goes from about 15 to 20 feet to about 45 to 50 feet. But it doesn't flow as a sheet, so that you get these channels, the kind of underground channels. And the theory is that the Palestine flow channel is where most of those tend to go, because it's flown for so long that it has open pathways. It's the path of least resistance, so to speak, because that's been flowing for so long. And that's from the geologist. I know nothing about Palestine flow channels, but the way he explained it to me is it's an old riverbed that has covered in, but is still a flow channel. That's all I have. Oh, I'm sorry, one thing I forgot to mention. I got contacted by MDE, Controlled Hazardous Substance Section. They're reopening the dry cleaner PCE case. They're going to send me a paper requesting from the town that we allow them to put monitoring wells down on Horsey Lane and in other locations, which I don't have all of them yet, that are owned by the town. The purpose of this is they're trying to reestablish what the groundwater flow paths are. So that right now we're saying the water flows from the hospital to the water plant. They're opening up the PCE investigation, but their focus is not keeping the pollution from getting to the water plant. Their focus is determining a different ground flow pattern. 20 some years ago, it was determined that the PCE came from the dry cleaners. And I think it was Park.
This is Park. This was Park. McBride's was over.
So Park.
McBride's is where Ellen's restaurant is.
This one. 20 years ago, they did an investigation and they found the highest levels here. And even 2 years ago, they sent us a nastygram about how when they did the research for 7-Eleven, there were high levels of PCE in the ground at the 7-Eleven site, and they told us we were responsible for making sure that everybody was safe and notified, and we sent them a letter back saying it's your job. We're not going to do your job.
Didn't they oversee a remediation of the Parkland site?
As far as I know, they did an investigation. They didn't do any remediation of the groundwater.
I thought that Mr. Bennett had to do the remediation before the 7-Eleven was built.
Yeah, they had to
They
dig
put in
out.
monitoring wells, and when they removed the tanks, they had to do some testing. And that testing showed very high levels of PCE. I'm not aware of any remediation other than soil removal around the tanks that had to be done.
I do remember that.
But there's very little chance that would get to our water supply.
Well, we've seen low levels of PCE, but nothing like what we see up here. I believe the numbers they got at 7-Eleven were 5,000 parts per million, in excess of 5,000 parts per million. And what we see is hit and miss at the water plant. Sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not, but it's never exceeded an action level.
What's the action level?
5 parts per million. It might be parts per billion, but we have not exceeded that at any time. The curious thing when I was talking to the lady on the phone is this wasn't being done to protect the water that we use. It was being done to evaluate groundwater flow patterns. They want to see if the PCE moved, what direction it's moving in. This, I think, is a realization of the promise that the Secretary of the Department of Environment made to us, that he was going to reopen the PCE and the MTBE cases. But the focus doesn't seem to be on reducing or eliminating the contamination. It's establishing a flow pattern. PCE is a VOC. It's a volatile organic carbon. It has nothing to do with fuel oil. It is not found in fuel oil, it is not part of fuel oil, and fuel oil is not part of it. It is I don't know that it's a synthetic product, but it is a manufactured chemical that gets produced for dry cleaning. You will not find it in any number 2 heating fuel. Same thing with MTBE. MTBE, the only other contaminant we've ever detected at the water plant, is an additive to gasoline. It is not a naturally occurring product in fuel oil. So what's happened is people are trying to confuse the issue. When we say we're concerned about oil contamination and VOC contamination, the Department of the Environment is saying, hey, don't be too quick to point at the hospital. You have other sources of VOC contamination, except that they're not related to each other. You cannot get one from the other. You can't mistake one for the other. It is just an attempt to redirect the focus away from what's going on at the hospital and the failures that we've seen with MDE in relating to remediating the site.